everybody. My name is Legend50210. I am a fight choreographer for a VRChat film group known as Sync Studios, and we are going to be presenting our research in regard to low-latency choreography, of which we're going to be learning about today. And besides me, I have some co-hosts that are going to be assisting me with some demonstrations. Want to start off?
Hi, I'm Romeo. I'm a martial artist at the service of Sync Studios. I joined them in December, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Hello, I'm Palm Top. I make content online, sing, dance, sometimes meow. I've been with them since the very first meetup, and it's been a joy to see how far it's come.
Hello, I'm Zogon Swift. I'm an improv actor, amateur programmer, modeler, world designer, and I'm working on a TTRPG world at the moment. It's awesome to be here at Furality. Thank you very much.
All right, we're very happy to be here. We do have a very heavy topic here that's going to cover a lot of stuff in regard to our month-long worth of research, covering about how we're able to calibrate actors and get people ready for complete unanimous synchronized choreography for VRChat films and sorts of media. So this is a very heavy topic, so we really hope that you're able to stick around. If you have questions, we are very open to that if we have time. But as we push on next, I just want to open up first briefly with a little bit of a special thanks for all the people that have dedicated the time to the creation and the process of this method. Starting off with our friends Gab Jenkins, Chevette. Those were the two big ones that originally helped us found this method. They helped us a lot with figuring out how this process would work for the Furality that happened before, which was Furality Silva, which is where our demonstration for the, what was it called? It was called the sparring lesson, where it was between myself in the States and our friend Chevette acting all the way in Singapore. This is where our first push of our method went on. Of course, another big thanks to Astro Melodia, Whole Lotta TJ, Virtual, DJ Cookie, and Photographer, who has also been a really good hand in also inspiring this method. And of course, major thanks to the three here, Romeo Red Wolf, Palm Top Chat, and Zircon Swift for being so handy and being here to demonstrate this method for us. With that out of the way, we are going to get started with our process. So, starting off, with the general things that you're going to need, it's important to know that you're going to make sure that you're going to want to need to have a video capture software as a way to be able to document references. This is more so like an optional step unless you're going to make something that's more specifically tailored to what you're doing. Otherwise, you could also just work from, like, let's say if there's like recreation of like a video that you want to do, you could also work from that as well, and you could skip part of that, at least for the recording process. Secondly, you'll need to make sure you have a video editing software of any kind. Does not matter too much on what it specifically is. You got your DaVinci Dissolve, Premiere Pro, you got your Final Cut Pro. Doesn't necessarily matter, any video editor of any kind. Thirdly, you need a sound editing software, something that you can look at in by time as opposed to like beats per minute, so and such. If they have settings you can adjust to see how things can be looked at for like a millisecond standpoint, you'll want something like that. Things like Audacity or GarageBand in my case. And then lastly, this final one is only for those who are body actors. You'll need at least a $5 license to SoundPad. You won't need it yourself if you were just going to be the camera operator, but if you are also going to act along with the actors, you will need at least a $5 license to SoundPad, which is what we use. But we'll be going into depth about why we specifically use SoundPad, at least at the time of our research. So, starting off, what is an audio script? To start off, an audio script is the name of it's the name of our system that we use, that we've created to be able to line up people across different areas. And it's a process to understand where we make use of auditory cues that are set up in a very on-rail manner. So that way people can't really rely on having to approximate for how long or how short like 500 milliseconds is, 300 milliseconds is, because that's specifically what you're looking for whenever you're doing this sort of thing. Whenever you're working with choreography from people all over the world, you're like really looking for that millisecond precise thing. You're really trying to get those actors as close as you possibly can without having one be slightly off and then saying, oh, just wait half a second, while the human imperfections make it really hard to know specifically how long half a second is. When you're making your audio script, you want to make sure that you have some distinct sounds going into it. We want to make sure you have one specific sound to help alert the actors of like what's to prepare before the beginning of your motion, and then also another sound that you'll need to identify the apex of when a motion is at its peak. In some cases, it's your fight choreography, or in other cases, if you're handshaking, it could be like the way of how your hands are changing direction at the same time. It's good to have these two sounds be relatively different. That way the actors are able to rely entirely on how they hear it and how they sound different. We'll be going into that process more in detail later on. To kind of start off on this, I have a little bit of a demonstration working along with PalmTubs and Zircon. So I'm going to give them a little bit of some choreography. I have a 3D marker here on my avatar. You should see that on the screen that's presented there. I'm going to be giving them a very simple choreography exercise that they're going to do. So let's say for both of these actors, both of you are in orthodox, but both of your left foot's front. Let's see. PalmTop, let's have you do a right hook up to here. Zircon, you can block up there with your left forearm. This will be mark number 1. So blocking up here for 1. For 2, PalmTop, you'll come low to the abdomen here to the side. Also blocking low for 2. And let's say for 3, Zircon will have you retaliate. So I'll have this be another color. Right there, line your face up to that. And PalmTop, you will flinch for this one. This will be number 3. All right, go ahead and practice that with the audience.
Touch?
We'll have that be a left back this, why not?
Okay. Right. Okay, so that's
All
the space I have. Okay, and
all right, so now what I have the actors doing, practice it with the audio scripts. These actors have audio scripts that they haven't listened to yet because I wanted them to go through some of the practicing process of what they're going through right now. What they are doing is that they are using the software SoundPad to be able to play a select sound of like nonverbal beeps and chimes to be able to indicate when their motions are to start and when they are supposed to be at their apex. The marker that we use is really handy in being able to have a dual perspective numbering system. It doesn't do it good justice from this perspective because it's only meant to be seen from 2 specific sides instead of it being like a 3D thing. But they are essentially practicing it. The idea is you want to fully ignore the other person you're working with. Well, our method for low latency choreography does help to mitigate the way of how actors can specifically act between each other. It will not get rid of latency between the actors because this is a way of how latency works because there's 3 perspectives to it. There is the sender, the receiver, and the observer. This is something I'll go more in depth about once we get later on into our process as they're continuing to practice. One of the reasons why we make use of these audio scripts and why we make use of sound cues, and also another reason why we make use of SoundPad is because as opposed to playing sounds through our microphone, where there can be some offsets in the way of how there are gaps interpreted through VRC speech, when a file is played on your computer, it's going to stay consistent. And I mean, assuming you have a computer that was made from the current generation, I don't imagine much systems would be able to falter from having a sound playing through your ear. But the idea is that these actors are going to be acting and ignoring each other, focusing entirely on the lines that I have drawn for them. Fighters, if you are ready. That's a yes. Zircon, you ready to go?
yes.
All right, both of you at your hotkeys. All right, and I'll be going in a little more in depth about all these other smaller components. This is just our first demonstration. Fighters, here we go. And on the hit markers, 3, 2, 1, go. Remember to mute. Very good, very good. Once more for the crowd. Alrighty, and here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. Very cool, very cool. And also, fighters, just for a little bit of perspective, since I know some people will probably be curious, go ahead and just illustrate which time zone you're in so people get an idea about where we are in the world. Starting with you, PalmTop.
Eastern Standard Time.
But just summertime.
So we got a fair bit of distance between these actors, which I think is really, really neat. But now, going on to our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what does an before that, some examples of our choreography don't extend to just general 3-hit choreography. It can also have more dynamicacies because of the fact that it is a sound file. You can work bit by bit on like how fast or how intricate the gaps end up being, instead of having something that some people tend to use, such as like metronomes, where it ends up being so rhythmic and you can almost kind of predict when actions tend to happen. But next thing to actually showcase is about what an audio script specifically sounds like. What do these actors specifically listen to? And that's what our next slide is going to be about. Slide number 7 of video. If we can get that going. You should be hearing a bunch of sounds as well as a little thing that will come up. Alrighty. So that's an idea of what an audio script sounds like. It sounds a little vague, but I'm going to be going over some of the parts of like what parts mean what and why we have certain things in certain areas. Okay, so before I go on to this next slide, I am also going to very, very briefly draw an audio script, getting a little bit closer for time. So I'm going to head over to this other side of the side here. I'll get back to the panel in a moment. I just want to very briefly touch on the components of what makes an audio script an audio script. To start off, we have very specific cues that stand out for our actors and what they specifically mean. This red bar that I am drawing here, I want you to kind of imagine this like the timeline of an audio script. These green lines that I'm placing right here, hang on. I'm not sure if the camera can see me from this angle. I can drag this a little bit if I need to. Or you know what, hold on. Fighters, switch positions with me. Here, I'll scoot it over here. Oh, no, hang on. Chasing the camera a little bit, my bad. No, my bad, okay, I'm here now. Okay, anyway, so here is a look at our audio script, for example. So you would have the initial starting beep. This is the first thing that plays about 1 second into your audio script. This is to help your actors understand that they press the hotkey for their audio script and it is beginning to play. This little bit here, which has 4 specifically spaced out beeps, which is to help to give the actor a general reminder of what speed the audio script is going at. Generally, we work between 500, 400, and very rarely 300 millisecond gaps before we get into the actual audio script, where it does not start until later, where before every hit marker, we place another beep that corresponds to the same gap in speed to here. So if set the speed between each audio scripts to be about 500 milliseconds in distance, the distance between the rest of the audio script is going to be about 500. So the distance between first beep and the hit mark is going to be 500. Any other one's 500, 500, and it will continue on from there. But I'll be touching more on that as I continue on with our presentation. But let's talk a little bit about creating the audio scripts. The very first thing you want to do is you want to find out what speed you're going to go at. The best way that you're going to want to do this is you want to be able to have some sort of reference you can go off of. Generally, I prefer if you're able to record yourself, being able to do these motions. Not only because it's a good habit to also for you to get a process of understanding what the actors have to go through, but to also get an idea about space limitations and how like everything feels when you're moving around with your equipment. It's very important to do this and record individual motions that have the most influence. Like let's say, for example, you're having like a one person fighting 2 other people. You would only realistically need to capture the spot for the one person that's having the most interactions. And then you would just formulate your audio script to accommodate for the other people that are also simultaneously working. But those people would also have specifically catered audio scripts for them. You just have a general baseline of what you're going off of. You would just need to do this for every single scene that you have a thing for your choreography for. Going on to our next slide, this is an example of like what it would look like when you're recording it. You want to record it with like a little bit of a gap in the beginning, which I'll talk about in a bit. Just a general striking toward the air, get an idea of what your moves have to be. Nothing has to be fast. You're able to experiment with your speed. Not everything has to be in rules of 3s. You can always experiment with like having up to 10 hits, push it beyond that if you want. You can go 5 hits. Let's say you have like 2 hits and then you have like a really long gap and then you have 3, 4, 5 and so and such. The customizability of the fact that it's an audio file means that we have a lot of leeway in how we are able to approach our choreography. Next, we should have another video on our 10th slide. This is an example of when you have like your side by side. On the top right shot, you have an example of like the references that I took and how they lined up with the rest of the actors. If we could just play that again really quickly, if you don't mind. For the again, the top right is essentially the one that I was acting for, and the middle ground, which was Romeo, is the person that's essentially mirroring the motion that I did with the choreography that I had created. And essentially, it's giving him a baseline of like what the speed's going at without needing to see anything, which is why we make use of auditory cues. All right. But now, after you have recorded all of your motions and you're ready to go on to the next step, now you want to start to take all of the video clips that you have taken and you want to throw that into a video editor of any kind. Anything, obviously, that can just play back and just look at audio. And this is the part where you want to make sure that you have a very specific sound to use as your your marker or your indication of when your motions are at their apex. In our case, we like to use just like a general Call of Duty hit marker sound effect because we think it's very short, very detached, very particular. Our actors are able to distinguish it between the beeps that we use because they're two very different sounds. And you'll just use this for any kind of video editing program that you'll be working with. And going into the program, my program of choice is Final Cut Pro. It's not required to be Final Cut Pro. You just need to have anything that can look at things from like a seconds, milliseconds standpoint, mostly just seconds. But the very first thing you want to do is at the very start, you want to make sure that you start off with a bit of a gap before the motions of your first hit. You're going to be working off of visuals, going bit by bit through your video, filtering through which bits, like say you're throwing your punches, or if you're having a handshake, for example, going up, down, when your momentum's changing, observing that, and you're going to be placing down all of your hit markers on those specific points. But you want to make sure you want to give yourself at least 6 seconds before the very first hit marker. So like in that video that showed before where it was me in that blue space, there was a bit of a gap before I actually threw that punch. It's the same premise here when you're going there in the video. Just align the beginning of your video to be cut until the very 6-second mark when you actually have it begin. We're going to be putting some stuff in that 6-second mark once we get to the actual more specific audio script creation process. But you'll essentially go through every little bit for the rest of your video, continuing to place markers all throughout the parts where you're having these impacts. And another benefit, if you have multiple recordings, you can also just make these in bulk. Just make sure you continue to abide by the 6-second intro rule, just like before, how it's starting from 0 seconds goes up to 6 seconds. Let's say that's like a 10-second clip overall. Then that means we're starting from the 10-second part. So if we want to have that 6-second gap, then we just kind of hit 6 seconds, make sure that our first impact of our second shot should happen at the 16-second mark because that's 6 seconds ahead of 10 seconds. If you're working in bulk, just continue going off of that process. Make sure you abide by having a little gap that's there. Make sure you apply that for every individual audio strip when you're working on them in bulk. And when you do export it as well, make sure that there should be no other sounds when you're exporting it as a video file, because we're going to be looking at waveforms for the next component when we go into the audio creation process. But now, speaking of, now we're going to talk a little bit about working on turning it into an audio script, because now this is like step number 3, because we went from recording the motions, placing the points of interest, and now we're going to make the rest of it, where we're going to be putting in the alerts, if you want to call it that. The preview cues are what we call them. This is where you will start to work off from a sound editing software, either Audacity or GarageBand, does not necessarily matter. As long as it's something that can preview and detail things by milliseconds, you really want to illustrate milliseconds here because we want to be as precise as we can and have as much fluidity as possible. You'll make sure that you will have your sound by this point. In our case, we use just a regular sensor beep because, again, it's short, it's articulated. I would honestly recommend against using things that roll into something. For example, if you like roll a cymbal, it's hard to identify like a specific point on that because it gradually gets louder. It's a lot better for us to use one specific distinct sound, like more staccato for those who are very enthused in music theory. We like to use those specific sounds because they're specific. They say here instead of maybe here, maybe there. It's here. And when you're working on these audio scripts, you're going to create a rule of what creates the speed of your audio script, which was that thing I mentioned earlier about working from things that are 500, 400, 300 milliseconds and such. But now we're going to get a little bit more into like the specifics working in the sound editing program. We're going to look into GarageBand to do some of this. Again, not a requirement, don't need to use GarageBand specifically. But now, to start off, when you are in your sound editing program, you're going to see all the spots where you have all the waveforms. Of course, by this point, it should look relatively flat, except for the spots where you have the hit markers. This is where you're going to throw in the video that you created with all the references and all the hit markers placed specifically there. It should just be a sound file by that point. You should just see the waveforms there. Make sure, again, that the time that it's displaying in your software is going to be showing in milliseconds. Make sure it is not beats per second or by time. You want to make sure it is by milliseconds. Make sure it's not just seconds, milliseconds. But now we're going to start off by putting stuff into the 6-second gap. We're going to go little by little over here. And to the next slide, you want to start off by putting your first pre-beat cue at the 1-second mark of your audio script. Sometimes this may vary based on like how fast or how slow your audio script may be, but it's good practice to be able to put that into the 1-second mark, because we're going to be working from there to lead up into the 1 second. This first beat is to help accommodate for to allow the actors to understand, okay, I have hit the button here, I know that the audio script has started, and I know to get into position. It might sound a little weird because of the fact that, you've pressed a hotkey, you'd expect it to immediately play the audio script, but this is where the importance of understanding where later on we're going to talk about synchronizing our actors and getting people more on the same length, because you're going to have instances where people are going to be needing delays. Because while we cannot realistically tell people who are slower to speed up, we can tell those who are faster to slow down. And that's why we have that little beat, because then you can press your thing, you wait, you hear it, and like, okay, I get in a position, ready to go. On to the next slide. You're going to move about 2 seconds later on down from the line. That little green marker that's there on the 1-second mark, that's the one that we placed earlier. Now you should have about you're going to be placing 4 more pre-beep cues. You're going to put that at the 3-second mark, or at least 2 seconds off from the first one. In this demonstration, we're going to be working from a 500 millisecond rule, which is a relatively slow. It's a relatively slow speed to work from, and this is the distance that we measure between the first pre-beep cue to the hit marker. It's very important to keep this rule and keep it consistent as to avoid confusing your actors. You want to make sure that from the 3-second mark, you're going to make sure that you place one every 500 milliseconds for at least 4 times. The purpose of this is to give the actors an auditory reminder of what 500 milliseconds sounds like. It's supposed to sound rhythmic, that way they say, okay, that's 500, 500. It puts them in the groove. Because again, by human nature, we don't realistically know the specifics of like how accurate 500 milliseconds is, 400, 300, so on and such like that. This is something that gives us a little rhythmic reminders like, okay, I know what this sounds like, I know what to prepare for the rest of the audio script. To our next slide, we go on a little bit more, and we should now be at the part where we are now going to be putting our pre-beeps before our hit markers. This is the part where you're going to be looking back to the waveforms of your audio scripts. You're going to look and see how that first hit marker you put at the 6-second mark, it should line up to the 6-second mark in your timeline. You want to make sure that you are placing all of your pre-beeps at least 500 milliseconds, if that's the rule that you're abiding by for the cue speed. You're going to place it 500 milliseconds away from the first hit marker. So if your first marker is happening, at the 6-second mark, like it typically should, you would place your first pre-beep cue 500 milliseconds back from that. So it would be at the 5-second, 500 millisecond mark. But if you were working on a faster script, like let's say you were going 400 milliseconds, then you would place that first one at the 5-minute and 600 millisecond mark. And you would continue on with that with all the rest of your hit markers being continuing to be either negative 400 or negative 500 based on which rule you want to go by. But you want to, again, remember to keep that rule. If you have your audio script that is keeping slow, 500, 500, 500, suddenly you start throwing 200s at them, you're going to start confusing and really making your actors have to start counting some of the hit markers and everything, which this is made to be more so consistent and more reliable. You want to make sure you're not confusing your actors when you're working along through this. And it's also important to note that when you're also doing this, you're only realistically measuring the distance between the pre-beep cue to the marker, meaning that you don't necessarily need the distance from the hit marker to the next beep to be the same. It does not need to be 500 after. So here is a drawn demonstration I will do. I'll step over to the side here. I'm going to draw a bit of an audio script here. I want you to imagine that this big line that I'm doing here, this is like our audio script. Going to be right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is like our audio script here. So let's say we have our first hit here. Again, the green lines here are meant to illustrate that these are like the beeps that happen. Again, this is your starting one. Thinking cue, say we're working for 500, get that slight gap. This is the 6-second mark, you get your first pre-beep, and then you get your hit marker right here. So because this is a 500 millisecond gap between each other, as it is here, you don't necessarily need the next one to have to be 500, because at that point, we're just making a complicated metronome. Rather, instead, if you have another motion that comes up relatively quick, you can still have it be like almost right after the previous one. And that would still be okay, because again, we're still going to only be abiding by what exists between the first pre-beep cue to the hit marker. And that can continue throughout the entirety of the script. The only time you would want to make sure that you're truly and realistically not confusing your actors is if you are going to be interjecting what happens within this cue. For example, you would never, ever realistically want to put another cue inside another cue that's supposed to be happening. So for example, if it looks something like this is something that would get incredibly confusing, like you have another one that's inside this other cue. This would be incredibly confusing, and you'd have your actors starting to start counting. This would be very confusing, and you'd have a lot of difficulties. Make sure that anything only realistically happens after your cues instead of inside them, because this is its own little thing. Nothing else touches this. It's good the way it is. Right. Away from that. And now, going on to our next bit. Oh, yes, count-ins. These are very handy if you have large gaps before a, these are very handy if you have like large gaps that require buildup. Or let's say if it even requires buildup, or you can use it for other more complex methods that we've gone through. You can use count-ins as a way to say 3, 2, 1, and then to prepare your actors to be able to do either, let's say like it's a giant spin kick, or if they're like taking a break for something before they come back into something, you can give them a 3, 2, 1 count-in using those pre-beep cues. And what you would do is making sure that your rule still applies. Like say in this demonstration that's here on the screen, where we have a hit marker on the 17-second point, and then our next one doesn't happen until about the 18.5-second point. So that gives us at least some degree of leeway, since we're working from 500, to put a pre-beep every 500 and alter the pitch to go beep, 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 and give our actors a way to be able to say, okay, big move, either I'm coming back in, or I'm doing, let's say, like a really large move. In other cases, you could even use it as a way of like having your actors' hands follow a set path and do what we refer to as like a more like an on-rail system. That's more complicated, as we also have demonstrations that make use of this. But more specifically, you would want to use these count-ins as a way to either, if you want to start your script more specifically, instead of relying on just the one, you would have to simply just drag back your syncing cue up back a little bit more, so that way you can make way for the count-in for the first or any other subsequent hit markers that you make use of for the rest of your script. But this is also where, you know, when you're working through the rest of your script as well, before I continue on, when you're working through the rest of your script, you'll know that you'll have those other bits that you've also worked on if you're working in bulk. Once again, same premise. You see that the hit marker is starting 6 seconds from there, and you know that from there, since it's starting 6 seconds in, all you do is you count back 6 seconds, and then that's how you know the other clip had ended, and then you count forward 1. That's your 1 second mark. Count forward 2. Then you get your counting. You get your syncing cue. Your cue speed, which is when you put the pre-beep cues at the 500 millisecond, assuming that's the speed that you go at. And then you would just continue going on through all the rest of the audio scripts as you have it all on one long track. And also, when you are all done with creating your audio scripts and you have all that sorted, this is where you you'd want to make sure you export it through your sound editing program as an MP3 file. You want to make sure that the final version of this is a sound file, because that's what we're going to be making use of for our actors to be listening when it is time to go. An example of like how many audio strips you can realistically have for your process. The amount that's on the right, that is, sometimes you might have a few. These are the amount of audio strips that we made use of for the sparring lesson, which is a VRChat film that we made for Furality Silva at the community showcase. But then there are other more experimental ones where sometimes if you have audio strips that work for just one person, you're gonna have, you know, let's say if it's like just between two people, you only really need just one audio strip to work between them because it's just two people acting on the same wavelength. However, if you have more complicated stuff like the stuff that's on the left, where you have like almost 99 audio scripts, you're going to need your audio strips to be catered to the individual actor. And this can be complicated if you have things like 1vx, like 1v many people, or if you have like more than like 2 people involved, you're going to need to have specific audio strips catered to specific people. In this case, you'll have audio scripts for like choreography, audio scripts for narrative stuff, and you'll have that like divided between people. And hear me out when I say this, please do organize early. You are going to save yourself a lot of headache. Start labeling stuff, make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be. Because the moment you're like, oh, did I make that thing? Is there something off with that thing? You're gonna start digging through like all these things. It's just a bunch of numbers and labels, and you're like, I have no idea where any of this is. I'm a relatively unorganized person, but like ever since I started picking up on these audio scripts, you really, really want to make sure you're keeping these things tidy. Keep them in folders, label them the way you need to. But now, onto our next step. This is now about using the audio script, because now we're all done with making the audio scripts. Because now that you have created all those sound files, this is where you're going to give them over to the actors that you're working with. Your actors are going to want to make sure that they have a $5 subscription to the software SoundPad. This exists on either Steam or you can get it from the direct website. There are some different hurdles based on where you get it. We have heard some certain things, such as if you get SoundPad through Steam, sometimes you can have issues where SoundPad has to be loaded from Steam from startup. Otherwise, sometimes you might need to restart Steam and then start SoundPad. Or if you use PayPal or whatever, you can get SoundPad from the website and just start it up and close it down whenever you want without needing to risk closing down your thing. It's kind of whichever end you prefer. I know there's a lot of people that aren't too fond of PayPal and whatnot, but just options that exist, website or Steam. And then, of course, make sure all of your actors have the dedicated audio strips they're supposed to have. An idea about what this setup would look like, again, this is just like how it would look like for if you are just the camera operator. And this is where I'm going to touch on like how latency is a bit different between the person who is recording, the person who is sending information, the person who's receiving information. Anybody who's been a veteran of VRChat knows that whenever, like, let's say somebody throws a punch at somebody in VR, if you're the one throwing the punch, like let's say someone gives you a cue to throw a punch at somebody, you make contact the same time you need to, which is perfectly fine, and then you see the person react late on your end, right? And then you look back on the receiver's end, when they receive the punch, they flinch, so they do the motion that they see on their end. And on their end, it looks fine. But then you look at the person who's observing and has zero influence, which would be us, the camera operator, who is not an actor. You would see that it's a weird mesh of both. So this is where you have a mixture of sender, receiver, observer. The general idea is that a sender is essentially somebody who has to give information to another actor, i.e., let's say giving a high five, giving a shoulder bump, let's say they're throwing a punch, throwing a kick, what have you. They're doing something that requires the reaction of another actor. You have the receiver, the person who needs to take information in and interpret that what they're being given, and they have to create a proper reaction in correspondence to that. And then you have the camera operator who has zero influence over both of these actors, which is basically, generally anybody else. All right. But again, from the panel, generally it would just be you as the camera operator there to record. You don't specifically need SoundPad yourself. You don't need the audio strips anymore at this point. You just need the other actors to have SoundPad and the audio strips. All right. And now I'm going to be taking Palm Top Zircon again. I'm going to make sure that you are both using the new audio strips. This is another demonstration that we can also make use of, and it's the fact that while a lot of people will tend to think of choreography as like just fight choreography, not everything has to be correspondent to fights. I know a lot of people tend to like think about things about like more narrative heavy stuff. So we can have more friendly oriented gestures by still having these be the same pattern. So let's say, for example, let's say our friends here, Palm Top, Zircon, so let's say you are out for that fight, you've all settled it out, you are now the best of the bros, right? So let's say we're gonna do a big secret handshake. We're actually doing really good for time, honestly. All right, so let's say we're gonna do a big secret handshake here, okay? All right, so let's say this center mark here, let's say you're going to do, this is gonna be your 1 and your 2. Let's say you're going to, using your right hand, you're going to go palm in, palm out, and then I'll have you do like a really big
Palm
bro
in?
fist. Yeah, palm in. So let's say I'll have you do really big, like a big fist bump right here. Okay, so you'll go, once again, you'll go palm in, lead with your hands going in, or with your right hand, and then left hand. And then you'll use your corresponding hand on that side to fist bump for 3. So go ahead and practice with that. This is going to
Is it
be
using the same
with
hand for the entire time?
Yeah, you can use the same hand. You're going to be using, make sure you're using the count-in. Practice with it. Right. And as they are practicing with it again, you'll learn to understand that these actors are having to make sure that they train themselves to ignore each other. They need to be able to focus entirely on what they're hearing. Because again, these actors are still going to have to deal with the other person moving either earlier or later and have to train themselves to not trust what they see, which is another reason why we make use of these markers. Because I actually have quite a bit of time at the current moment, I'll be able to actually very briefly go over my numbering system that I make for these actors, because it doesn't do it much justice from this perspective that I have it here, but essentially we have created a very specific numbering system that is able to work from both sides of our actors. That way we're not having 3s look like E's or 5s looking like S's, where we can be more specific about what number means what. So far we've gotten up to 10, but I think at some point we're going to be able to start pushing on that. Yeah, there are other things that you can also use this for. I know we've had some, you can use this for handshakes, for example. What you would probably do in that case is you'd make use of, just a very simple audio strips. You just go constantly back and forth, tick, 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 back and forth, back to back to back to back. You could go 500, 400, 300. It depends on how fast your handshake's going. And you would have that be based off of like, let's say if you're making, if you're clasping hands with your other actor, if you go up and you meet your apex, this would be a hit marker, and you the hit marker to come back down, hit marker. You imagine it like you're hitting invisible lines, so you go bang, 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 and that's another way that you would be able to use this method for your choreography. Again, does not need to be required for just fight choreography. It could be for like narrative choreography. Okay, and fighters, are you ready?
So is it through the left first or the right first?
Go palm first, backhand.
Okay.
So you would go inward first.
Okay.
Palm, backhand, fist. All right. And if you're both good to go.
Yep.
All righty. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. And mute. Yeah, there you go. Pretty snazzy, huh? One more time for the audience. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. There we go. Fun little bros we are. But that is an example of these audio strips working for more friendly gestures. Now, again, not required for more aggressive things. It's anything that requires a shift of momentum between multiple actors. If anything, it's more apt to avatar interactions. All right, going on. Oh, yeah. Now, also, here's a big question. I'm also imagining a lot of you are wondering why I'm throwing an emoji. The big thing here is whenever you're using your voice and you have gaps with the way that you speak, sometimes VRChat will kind of offset the way or over-exaggerate the gaps in the way that you speak, and it can cause it to be offset based on per person of who's hearing it, which is one of the reasons why we can't realistically say realistically say go and have them go off of that. Rather, instead, what we can do is we can make use of VRChat emojis, because through the use of VRChat emojis, these are actually network synced across all platforms, meaning that when I make use of this emoji, this means everyone is going to see this at the same time. Romeo, Zircon, Palm Top, all this stuff in the background. When I throw this emoji, they're going to see it at the same time. And what's really interesting is when that is happening, you can even try this yourself as well. Where if you give a verbal 3, 2, 1, and then when you say go and throw out the emoji, if you hear anybody else do it and you know that the moment that they're saying go and throwing out the emoji, you're always going to notice that the emoji is going to come out way earlier than before they say go. And it's because we rely on the emoji to be a more definitive point is why we can have our actors rely on that to press their hotkeys to start their audio scripts. But now, next thing I want to talk about is calibrating your actors. This is a big thing about why we specifically use SoundPad. Because we have a lot of people in very different zones, people who live in Australia, Europe, Singapore, in the States, wherever you may be. It's very important to take note that, not everything's going to be perfect, which is why we've had such fortunate success with Palm Top and Zircon. But before I also get ahead of myself, it's also important to note that ping is not entirely relevant as long as it's stable. It does not need to be, it does not matter if you have 150 ping, 200 ping, let's say you have 30 ping. I mean, heck, if you have like 500 ping, I don't think I've ever seen anyone with that much ping. But as long as that number is relatively stable, you are a suitable actor for this process, which, if anything, for a standard like today, that should be about like at least 99% of VRChat users. Because the easiest way you'd be able to check that is you would just simply look at your VRChat menu and just keep an eye on like your ping, observe it, and you just see, make sure that's all consistent. But what you would do is that if you need to adjust your actors, you would very simply go into the settings of SoundPad and just adjust the push-to-talk delay, which is what we make use of. And to show that very briefly, fighters, I'm going to have you all calibrated to show all 3 of these fighters in action. I'm going to have them calibrate. Make sure all 3 of you have the syncing cue. The process that we do is with the same thing, same method. I give them a verbal 3, 2, 1, have them rely on the emoji. And when they see that, they hit their hotkey. And what I have them do is I have them do 4 punches to freeze on the hit marker. 3, 2, 1, go. Good. And when they do that, my goal of the observer is to watch when their punches freeze. All right. And you want to run this through a couple times and see where these actors are specifically stopping. So go again. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. Watch it through again. Observe for any outliers. So here we see Palm and Zircon are relatively on time, and we have Romeo who is lagging behind. In this case, while we wouldn't necessarily tell Romeo to speed up, we would actually tell Palm Top and Zircon to slow down. And this is where that human element comes in with SoundPad. So in this case, I would take an approximation of how much in milliseconds I would have be applied for both Palm Top and Zircon. In this case, Palm Top, Zircon, let's have both of you add let's go 215 millisecond delay on top of whatever you have. So now what they're doing is they're going into 215.
Okay.
They're going through their settings right now. They're going to the specific location of it in SoundPad is you go to File, Preferences, and in Audio, it's the push-to-talk delay. You can set up to 5,000 milliseconds, which is equivalent to 5 seconds of a delay that you can do to offset your actors. All right, fighters, and once you're ready to go. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. We'll watch and observe them. All right, one more time. I think maybe just a slight adjustment. There we go. 3, 2, 1, go. And also, one thing I also forgot to mention is that the benefit of going through this process, this is a calibration process that we'll always typically do at the beginning of our sessions. You'll only really need to do this once to get your actors lined up. And then after that, you are perfectly set for the entirety of your thing as long as nothing massive changes. Okay, palm top zircon at 100. So once these actors are lined up and all good to go, then there's not much more that they really need to be able to, there's not much more they realistically need to do because they're all set, they're all good. There's nothing else that they really need to take care of because they'll be lined up. As long as their pings are not fluctuating, the number that we're looking for is you watch your ping to see that it's not jumping any higher between 10 to 15 positive or negative. You want to make sure it's at least resting somewhere. Like in my case, my ping is at 64. It's staying relatively stable. You'd observe this for at least a full minute. Watch it to make sure it's not making massive jumps, massive lag spikes. Sometimes if you're in large cramped instances, sometimes it may be a bit challenging because you're connected to so many other people and lag may play effect. But in our case, in a more controlled environment, this is a lot easier to take care of. There we go. 3, 2, 1, go. And you watch for their punches. Isn't that something, huh? One more time for the audience, and then we'll wrap up. Alrighty, here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. And once again, now that I have these actors relatively synced up with the way that they punch and they freeze, these actors are good to go for the rest of this instance, as long as everything is relatively stable. And I'll be able to give them any sort of choreography that I'm able to throw at them now that I know they're lined up. And that should hopefully wrap up our presentation. And to finally close off, we have a very, very short video to show off some other more intensive examples of our choreography. Go ahead and put that on before we get to our Q&A. All right, thank you so much for having us. We're really, really happy that we got to this point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Legend, and everyone. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to start out with Golden Flag. I know this was briefly mentioned, but I'm curious as to why you decided not to stick to a metronome. Did you try using metronomes? If you did, what went wrong?
So there's nothing entirely wrong with making use of a metronome. The reason why we try to avoid using a metronome is because a lot of your motions will end up being so hypnotic. Being able to specifically detail when specifically your motions can happen makes it far more dynamic. Let's say like if you have your motions being like bang, 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 you know, it's so consistent to a point where you're kind of being able to expect what happens. Being able to rely on like having a physical reference and then having your audio scripts formatted over that allows you to be more accustomed to how you're doing your choreography. It's just the way that we're able to format our stuff.
All right, I'm gonna give you one more question. This is from Kick Kingdom, who's right over there in the audience. Does everyone need to use the same input, hotkey versus overlay?
Yes, that's a good question. So typically when you're interacting with the way that you start your audio scripts, you always want to make sure that the way you're doing it is the same input method. And that's like if you have someone clicking with a mouse, hitting a button on their physical keyboard, or clicking it through either a VRChat window or a third-party overlay, you want to make sure all of your actors are using the exact same method, as to make sure that if you're using a third-party overlay, sometimes the way that the input's registered when you're pulling your trigger can be a bit different between somebody who's clicking it on a mouse or clicking it on the Steam overlay. You're going to have inconsistencies. You want to make sure everyone's using the same input method, which is why you saw all these actors step aside to their physical keyboards to press a hotkey.
All right, awesome. Legend, Palm Top, Zircon, and Romeo, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it so much.
Of course. Thank
for
you all
having
so
us.
much. We're really happy
Thanks
to
for
be
having
here.
us.
Thank you, Furality, and everybody so much for having us. We hope you all have a wonderful rest of your FurRecon.
Thank you for hitting me in the face. I appreciated that.
Welcome. You want another?
I think that was not gonna
Yo,
pop
yo,
up.
yo.
We were still live.
We're all.